All right, thank you. Well, I'm trying to quickly do a head count here. Who is missing? Well, we'll get rolling. We'll see who shows up. Well, thanks everybody for dialing back in. And I guess I wanted to take a minute at the beginning tonight and see if we had any questions or follow-up. I looked at the meeting minutes and I didn't see any comments or notes in there. So I hate to assume that we're all good with the recommendations we came up in there without a little bit of a discussion, but I guess let me ask this. Did anyone get a chance to take a look at it? All right. So maybe what I'll do is I'll take a couple of minutes now and just maybe share that and run through the recommendations from last week and see if we've got any additional comments or follow up, and then we'll just jump right into tonight's kind of continuation of use of force. So let me... Okay, I think we should be here. And once again, thanks to Cheryl for taking these notes for us. The first recommendation came here early in the discussion. It was just around the council adopting the current use of force policy and then requiring that that ordinance that changes be put through city council. And if anyone's got any hands up or comments, just let me know. I've got it on reduced screen, so I may not see all the hands go up or something. The second one here, the recommendation was to present the data on the use of force incidents by population and ethnicity segments. And then there was also the request here within this to look at the SB 217 data and then incorporating that on the website. The next one, I think a little bit somewhat related, right, is to create the system that enables us to track and leverage those data insights. And I think that that's the system that we discussed was coming online in a month or so. Is that correct? Don't know who I should be asking that question of.
Yeah, that starts the end of October, third week of October.
All right, let me just add that in there. Oh, it's gonna be a long ways away. All right, the next one, let's see, we had two more. So have the EPD legal team consider removing identification of excited delirium, right? And then I added in this note Cynthia had sent along when she was having some audio issues last week, and I think we even incorporated that in our discussion. But it seems like we may need to have additional discussion on that. And then the other one was ensuring that the definition is accurate, which I think is really the discussion there.
This is Cynthia. I appreciated I emailed with Paul and Ain afterwards since I was having such horrible audio problems. This policy, this section of the content, I think is actually really well written, very descriptive, and I don't disagree at all with excited delirium. So just since you all can hear me today, I just wanted to clarify that. My only issue was looking at it as a serious medical condition, potentially instead of thinking of it as an emergency or a medical emergency. It was the condition that was not sitting well with me, because this is really more of a legal term as opposed to a medical term. And that was my only concern with that one phrase.
And Cynthia's clarification in her email, and when she's actually able to talk, and it's not through a third party, I completely agree. My concern was removing the idea that it is a medical emergency, and I thought that was the push, and that's not the case. It's merely definitional.
Okay. Great, I appreciate that, and thanks for connecting offline on that. Let's see, I think we have a couple more here. Yes. All right. And then the next one was around the 40 millimeter rubber bullets, that they should be disallowed in crowd control, crowd dispersal tools, but also allowed for officer protection or allowed to control individual humans. All right, the next one, we should roll this into the use of force consideration for council to vote on. If police department wants to change the resolution, that's the same as the one we started off the session with at the top. And I think there's two more. Oh no, there's a bunch more. That's right at the end. So this next one, number 3 here, look at de-escalation holistically during training and additionally throughout the community and doing the education piece of that. And then Chief had a recommendation, right? So focusing the efforts moving forward to identify all of the de-escalation training needs and the foci on implementation and training. And then we have to look at each discipline and keep hammering away at the education side. Any questions there?
Just on that, I believe I'm meeting with the chief. Are we meeting tomorrow? Chief Collins?
I think you and Chad are meeting tomorrow.
Okay. To try and pull together that training stuff so that we can hopefully have it for everybody next week. And I'm going to help out with it a little bit to try and make sure that we've got all of that and that it's, kind of what the committee has been looking for.
Okay, thank you. So this next one, there's however, a need for greater resources to communicate and educate the community. The sense I get is that I don't know if this is separate from kind of this other one that we talked about, educating the community about use of force. Does anyone remember, or is this separate?
John, this is Cheryl. I think it got repeated in conversation, and in my flurry to get everything documented, I wrote it. I think it's the same as was included in that number 4. Yeah.
All right. All right. So then the next one is the verbal de-escalation, being used as a primary tactic when possible in attempting to non-violently de-escalate. That's tricky phrasing, non-violently de-escalate. Okay.
Sorry, this is Amy.
I'm sorry.
This is Amy. I wanted to ask, is that not currently what is best practice already?
Oh, I think it is.
So I wanted to clarify, like, if it is, then why do we need to recommend it? Is more of a question. I mean, of course I agree with it. It's more of a question of, I'm not clear what we are recommending when it is already currently being best practice.
Probably note taker error, Amy.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Or, this is what John Stone would say. Is this written somewhere in ordinance somewhere, or in policy in the police force that is best practice or part of the training for the officers in Inglewood?
Chad, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is a part of the basic field training officer program, because generally what happens when you meet somebody who's just simply having a disagreement with somebody, the first attempt is to bring the level of conflict down. And so, and that's part of the de-escalation training that everybody receives. So Chad, if you disagree, speak up.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, verbal de-escalation techniques are the first thing that an officer uses on any kind of call. We're using our words to communicate and control a situation, to keep people safe and the officer safe. So it's implemented immediately on any call for service.
All right, so sounds like we can strike that one since it's
So,
already.
real quick, the issue was that in the use of force policy, it is referred to as an alternative de-escalation tactic. And that's why we were saying verbal de-escalation should be a primary tactic, not an alternative de-escalation tactic.
I would
Yes,
agree
I
with
remember
that.
that now.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like it should stay in, and so the emphasis here is on primary. All right, thank you for that, John. All right, and then the last one is look at what happens when the community experiences a bad outcome and make a plan for what the police department will do to make the community whole once again. We have to find a way to restore that relationship with the community. Oop. All right, I think that's it.
Hey, John, could I make one comment just about, so I apologize, going back to the first recommendation, just I was thinking around the resolution for council to review changes to the use of force policy. If I remember right, last week, I think Chad mentioned that that policy is changed or at least tweaked like once every couple weeks. I could be wrong in remembering that, but I'd love some clarity. And if that's true, I wonder if it might be better to identify like a quarterly review or an annual review for council rather than every time. Because if it's true that it gets tweaked every couple of weeks, that thing's going to show up on council agenda pretty much every meeting.
No, it's not. It's not every few weeks. That would be an absolute extreme example. There are times when we have updates that come out very quickly that need to be implemented into policy. But I would venture to guess, and this is just a complete guess, that a policy such as a use of force policy is typically updated a few times a year, and that's it.
Okay, that's helpful. I was just misremembering that.
And one other comment that I would have is that perhaps it might be a good idea to kind of identify which ones you're talking about for council, because council's not going to want some of these very mundane policy changes. I would suspect that after a lengthy discussion, we could decide on all use of force policies to get changed, we can bring to their attention. But some of these minor ones that we get, whether it's in grammatical or spelling or whatever, I don't think you want the entire policy manual.
So maybe it would be better to just say council's going to do an annual review of the use of force policy or a quarterly review, and whether there have been changes. That if there haven't been, it makes council's job easy, and if there have been, then council has the chance to review any changes that have been made.
Well, I do want to bring back up that it wasn't just for us to be aware of the changes, but for us to approve the use of force policy to be in effect, right? So it's not simply making council aware of the use of force policy, because Member Anderson proposed this as a solution to my desire to codify certain elements of the use of force policy. And he suggested that maybe we just review it when it gets changed, when there's a proposed to change it. And so if the suggestion was to just go to a yearly review of the policy, I would want to reopen the discussion around the things that I think need to be codified. Because part of the point of that is to make it something that is not unilaterally done by the police department.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And grammatical errors, like, we don't ask the city attorney to bring grammatical errors back to us after we vote on a contract or something like that, that kind of stuff is not something that I think would need to be brought before council,
Gotcha.
So.
Yeah, so maybe the core of what I'm saying is I would want to have a good understanding of what types of changes would need to be brought to council then. Like who's to judge whether it's a grammatical error or a major change, And I don't know that I have an answer to that. I was throwing out a interval, but your point is good, that doesn't necessarily give the type of veto power that we were advocating for last week. But yeah, I guess I'll maybe just pose the question: who's the judge then of what's a grammatical error? What is a change that's worth bringing to council?
It's a good question.
You know,
Hey, if I could jump in, could I jump in here real quick?
sure.
I talked to our assistant city attorney Alex Dortic today, and he's kind of suggested that maybe like if we can figure out what we're after, which I think what John and I both wanted last meeting was something where this the use of force policy is regularly reviewed and approved in some manner. The legality of doing that, whether it's by code or resolution or whatever, is kind of neither here nor there. It's getting at the aim of what we want. I would like to just suggest that we have some means in place of regularly reviewing and approving it, and kick it over to our attorney's office to make recommendations as to the best way to accomplish that aim.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, John Stone, does that approval piece, not just the review, but also the council's ability to approve or disapprove the policy, does that get at what you're looking for of that?
Yeah.
That veto power?
Yeah, I want council to approve the policy. And if there's going to be, changes made to that policy that will affect citizens, then I think it's something that council needs to weigh in on and have the ultimate say on, because we're the ones that are elected by the citizens to represent their interests. And I think this is a major interest, is how our community is made safe by our law enforcement.
So help me understand, and maybe for everyone else, where we're landing with this one then in the language here. So is the idea that you want the city council will adopt the current use of force policy by well, I guess it won't be, but will it be by resolution, or are you just going to make it by some calendar?
I don't know if the specific means matters. I would just say that the city council reviews and approves the use of force policy in some manner, and then we'll just refer that to our city attorney for a recommendation.
Yeah, and they can determine whether it's by resolution or by ordinance, what the reasonable kind of levels are, and what we actually can have a say in, because there is some stuff that's state level, right? That, whether the department wanted to change it or we wanted to change it, we can't, because it's mandated at the state level. So that'll be something that the attorney's office will have to manage anyways.
And Joan, what I was going to suggest is for a pecking order, if we come up with a change in our policy, that we sit down with Alex Storterek, the assistant city attorney, and they can make a decision on whether or not it's necessary to send it to council or not. And so there we have a segue to get that information to you.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that seems like a good solution to me, to have some third party. I think the city attorney's office would be great as the decision maker of which edits go to council, which edits are okay not to.
All right, so now I think I'm hearing something different than what we have there, because you're suggesting that a third party review the changes and then present them to council?
Just the city attorney's office.
Yeah, the city attorney's office would review any edits, and if it is truly just a grammatical thing that council doesn't need to see, the city attorney's office would have the power to say that. And if it is a substantive enough change to bring to council, then the city attorney's office would make that decision too.
So the determination now, I just want to make sure I'm clear, the determination now will be done at the city attorney level and not by council, correct?
Well, council would be the final word. Whether or not it needs to be referred to council would be decided by the city attorney's office.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So attorney is going to review changes, and if, I don't know, significant, city council for
review and approval.
Yeah.
Oh, there she goes. All right.
And I think we do want to send this current one to city council as well. Not to wait for a change, but to send this one to city council as well, currently, to start this process.
Okay. All right. Anything else there? Trying to scroll through and see if I see any hands. All right, I think we're good. All right, so tonight we are continuing with the use of force. And I think we largely have the same set of documents as we did last week. And so this week is mainly around warnings before discharging a firearm, requirements for officers to stop or attempt to stop another officer when force is being inappropriately applied or is no longer required, shooting at a moving vehicle, and then a discussion about the use of force continuum and fleeing felons. So I guess with that, Chad or Chief or someone, I guess from the police department, is it worth it to give a quick, 2-minute overview of where we stand with those policies? And I guess, and I think about it in relation to, that 21st Policing Task Force or any kind of the best practices that we were looking at last week.
Well, what I can tell you is that officers are trained to issue a warning prior to the application of deadly force when feasible, and that's the key element there. The example I gave you last week, where 2 officers were given 2 totally different scenarios, one where she could not provide a warning because she was already being fired upon. And then the second one, the officer was successful and the subject back off and went into his house. So to me, the critical part of this policy is when feasible. Otherwise, officers have to issue that warning.
All right. Any questions or thought about that? And I guess I'm trying to dig through and find exactly where that is. Leticia, please.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Pretty much what the chief said, when feasible. Obviously there's times where it's just not feasible and you're surprised, but I think the important thing is when feasible, and that's not always possible, if that makes any sense. I mean, it's basic. That's all I have to say about that.
Any concerns about, oh, Paul, I'm sorry, I see your hand there.
Just a thought, and I think the way the chief articulated the policy is really important. An observation from other departments and cases from across the country that I've seen is that there is not a lot of good training on how to communicate while an officer has their gun drawn, right? We teach communication skills, we teach firearm skills, and typically that articulation over top of a firearm is stop, please don't move, stop, please drop the gun, right? And we see that in the academy, and we see that play out over and over again on these cases. And so from a recommendation standpoint, it would just be to on the training level, work on communication skills during those critical incidents. So on the firearms, working on communicating the way we want officers to communicate before they'd have to shoot or while they're shooting, I think is really important, because currently what I've seen across the country, not with Englewood PD, is that is lacking.
John Stone.
Thank you. And thank you, Paul. I think you hit the nail right on the head with that, is the how is it communicated? Because I agree. I'm one of the few people, maybe besides our officers, who's been shot at a few times in life. And sometimes it starts happening without you knowing what's going on. And there's not a whole lot of time to do anything other than start physically reacting, right? So I don't think that we need to change the wording on this use of force policy, because I don't expect officers to attempt to warn someone that they're going to return fire when they're being attacked by someone. You know, that's not a reasonable expectation. However, the way that communication happens is really important. You know, when Paul was repeating the stop police, right? I had this immediate reaction of like, that's when I run. So that's probably not a good thing. And I'd be more interested in learning more about what those trainings could look like to ensure efficient and effective. So I think that's really the key, right, Paul, is that effective communication, especially in a situation where there's that like heightened tension and stress for both parties, and then being able to communicate effectively under that pressure. Is that kind of what you're talking about, Paul?
Well, from a research standpoint, we know that we have a limited focus of attention, right? And so if our attentional resources are taken up by what's happening in front of us, and all we have to fall back on is that training, then that's really what's going to come out, right? Stop, police, don't move. Stop, police, don't move. And we see that kind of repeated because officers have no attentional resources to give to that. And what I'd like to see on that, and what I don't currently see with firearms training, is an integration of communication skills so that officers have something to fall back on that they don't have to think about, and that communication skills start to come kind of naturally, just like we want those gun skills to be natural, and officers don't have to give those focus of attention to that. And so I'd like to see more of an integration across the board with training on that. And hopefully Englewood PD, I'm sure they're doing some of that with their reality-based training. But I think from what I've seen across the country, that's an area that a lot of police departments could improve.
Thanks. Guillermo.
So I'm looking at the use of force policy, and under warning shots, which I believe is 300.4.2, there are only circumstances where you cannot use warning shots. And given everything that we're talking about, when I first read this, I was like, okay, well, where are the instances where you can use them? And Chief, you discussed them, but was just wondering why the situations to use warning shots weren't included, or is it somewhere else that I didn't see?
We don't do warning shots, so I'm trying to find that. Guillermo, where did you say that was?
I believe John just pulled it up. So
yeah, I have it. It's on the screen share, but it's in the use of force document, section 300.4.2.
Yeah,
page 42.
We don't condone warning shots at all. And I think that's what this says.
yeah, and what I was just hearing is that some warning shots are situational as well. So should there be language for the use of warning shots, or is it just completely off?
It's completely off the table. If an officer has to fire his weapon, then it's when they intend to use deadly force.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
That's really the only time.
Thank you.
All right. So I guess to kind of close this one out, then, what I'm hearing is a recommendation around the training for discharge, correct, from Paul? And that's to integrate Amy, sorry, go ahead, Amy, before I finish.
Yeah, I think I wanted to follow up on what Guillermo was saying. I think by saying when we shouldn't use it, it creates a scenario where you think, oh, are there scenarios when we do, right? And Chief Collins just says we don't, right? And so I was looking at two different documents, like looking at the police community report, it talks about discharging, but in the actual policy, it just talks about when not to use it. So the language is confusing to me. I don't know if it needs to be a change or recommendation, but I would like this group to discuss this a little bit further regarding when you say here are situations where you don't do something. It makes me think there are situations when you do. So I wanted to see maybe if
I can
Collins has a thought about updating that.
If I can chime in on that real quick, and I'm sorry, I've got a bad internet connection and my video is not working, so I'm not hiding tonight. There's no instance where we would ever implement a warning shot. That is not best practice anywhere, to my knowledge, in the United States. So I know we talked a lot about last week how we don't want to have verbiage that only allows our officers to do a certain thing, but in no instance would we ever issue a warning shot ever in this day and age.
So would a recommendation be just what you just said, what Chad just said?
It'll save
Rather
some
than
ink.
shall not be?
That's what it said. That was my read of what it actually says.
I think maybe what Amy is suggesting is to just change it to a single line that says, under no circumstances shall an officer discharge a warning shot of any kind. You know, just make it one sentence, because I get what she's saying is when you call out specific instances in which it can't be used, it suggests that there are instances in which it can be used, right? And you know, making it as simple and straightforward, if it's a single sentence that just says, under no circumstances shall any officer of Inglewood Police Department use a warning shot, you know, something along those lines. Makes it easy.
Well, it's the attorneys that wrote this policy, so maybe therein lies the answer. We'll check with Lexipol, and I would put that recommendation in so we don't miss that and make sure that we follow up on it.
Can I chime in?
Great. Yeah, and then I'll go to John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Go ahead. You're fine.
Okay. I was shaking my head because it was like, warning shots. I mean, no, I mean, that just only happens in movies. That verbiage shouldn't be in there at all. We don't do that. I mean, if we're going to pull our weapon and shoot, we're going to do it to protect our life and the lives of the people in the community who might be in the area during that incident. And another thing that's really troubling about warning shots is it can make other officers or the person that you're dealing with who may have a weapon is what we call sympathetic fire. And then you have a whole different mess there. So in closing, I think that just needs to be just that one line. Under no circumstances are any warning shots to be fired, or whatever the verbiage was. Thank you, and I'm sorry I butted in.
That's all right. It was John said he didn't mind.
Yeah, not a problem. I think you said it very well.
All right. Well, and I think with that recommendation, just to refer this and check with legal and make sure there's not some legal reason why the language is so verbose. And does that sound good to everyone? All right. And I think we've kind of, oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to let the officer finish what she was saying because it was on this same subject. And I realized that there was something that I'd wanted to look at in that warning before using deadly force. It currently says when reasonable. And I wanted to see if the officers or the chief or anybody had any feelings on changing it to when possible. Because I think that there's a strong argument that it's not always possible. But I think that if it's possible, then it's probably reasonable as well. And I don't know if there's a legal issue there. It looks like Paul has an answer to that.
I would say that it's almost always possible, right? Especially in hindsight, right? It may be possible to tell somebody that is about to shoot you that you're going to return fire, whereas it may not be reasonable to do that. Where you may where you should be focusing your attention on returning fire, right? And so I think between possible and reasonable, I like the term feasible that the chief used earlier, but I do think when you kind of put in absolutes like possible, that leaves a lot of things are possible but not necessarily reasonable.
Right,
I was-
thank you.
I was told the term feasible was, and it's not, it's what I would consider a reliable source, but the Supreme Court used that term. And so I think that's why that term is in there.
Well, right now it says reasonable. So, if feasible is what you're saying.
Feasible is what's in there now. Warnings before discharging a firearm in the very first sentence.
Okay, so the one that I've got says when reasonable, the officer shall prior to the use of deadly force. Do you have maybe an updated version? That's,
So,
yeah,
John,
that's not what mine says.
John, can you let us know which version you're
Sure.
looking at?
Yeah,
Is it-
so it was the one that when I clicked on the link in the email, it took me to this policy, which is the EPD use of force policy PDF. I can screen share if you'd like.
Yeah, go for it. I have mine up. I'm just wondering if yours is different. So let me stop and then you can.
Yeah.
But,
So
yeah, I see it. It says feasible under the vehicle, moving vehicles, and it says
Right.
reasonable under 4.3.
So yeah, 4 point right here. When reasonable, the officer. 300.4.
Right, and then I think what we were looking at before was 300.4.1 under moving vehicles, where it says
Right.
feasible.
Yeah.
So
So
it's
I
reasonable in kind of the main section heading, and then feasible in one of the subsections.
right, and
I think
that's
the other-
specifically around.
Guys, I just want to be clear. What Guillermo originally referred us to was section 300 dot. Let me. Now I lost it.
Yeah, that was about warning
Dot
shots.
4.2.
Right.
For warning shots.
Right. And this is about giving verbal warning before using deadly force if possible, not about warning shots. So when we were talking about, it's not always something that can be done, but if it can be done, it should be done. And I was suggesting possible, but I fully accept Paul's reasoning behind why that's kind of an absolute. But I think feasible is a good word to put there, because I think reasonable is just too vague. And it's been shown in court cases over and over and over again that reasonable is a very subjective term.
So, Joe, I see your hand up, and I want to get back to you, but I want to make sure we kind of wrap this. It sounds like we could almost make a recommendation to ask the attorneys to look at that entire section 300.4, all of it, and try to insert the word feasible where reasonable.
Sure.
All right. And Joe.
Okay, the only thing I wanted to, and I think that pretty much covers it. I just thought it looks like the section about warning shots has not just times where you aren't supposed to fire warning shots, but where you aren't supposed to fire at all to stop a theft and that kind of thing. So I wonder if the heading should be changed rather than the, I don't want to eliminate something where they're trying to restrict other times they can't fire in addition to warning shots. But I think if we refer that to the attorneys, they'll figure it out.
Okay, so Joe, I want to make sure. So you're good with it as is in terms of asking to change the language to feasible, and that the subsection around warning shots is potentially okay as is?
Well, I mean, I don't want to eliminate all of those lines that are talking about non-warning shot kinds of things, just so we make it clear on the warning shot, because it does say don't. I don't have it up anymore. Anyway, yeah, I don't.
It says officers shall not, blah, blah, blah.
Right, shall not shoot when somebody's committing theft or something like,
Yeah.
To stop a theft. We don't
Shots
want
shall not be fired at persons who have committed only a misdemeanor or traffic violation. Shots shall not be fired merely to prevent the destruction or theft of property. Shots shall not be fired to halt any person who simply runs away to avoid arrest.
Yeah, so that sounds like it's going beyond just warning, prohibiting warning shots, but also prescribing when they can't fire at all. So
It's interesting. My read of that is that all of those lines refer to warning shots because they fall under the heading of warning shots, but I definitely recognize how that can be confusing. So maybe that's part of the recommendation, is to have attorneys just look through that. And I don't know if that's just a tactic to abbreviate, but yeah, the first line says warning shots. They're all under the heading of warning shots, but then the last several lines just say shots, which, yeah, that's confusing when you read through it.
Chief, can you tell us whether or not those lines apply to warning shots or any type of shot? You're on mute. Chief, you're still on mute. Are you there? It looks like he froze to me. Okay. All right, I got him in small screen, so I couldn't tell. Oh, there he is. John, are you back?
He just texted me and said he's having a little bit of computer issues, obviously, so.
All right. Well, Chad, do you know what the current policy is? Could an officer, I guess, fire a shot at a person who has committed only a misdemeanor or traffic violation?
I'll never say never, but typically no. There has to be a lot of mitigating circumstances, and you have to look at the totality of the circumstances to pin down these situations. So routinely, no, we would not do that. But if there's a mitigating circumstance where it was reasonable and authorized, then yes, we could. So it's very subjective. It's my belief that this section of the use of force policy is strictly related to warning shots only.
And I think that's a fair assumption for us to make. So let's add that to our recommendations and have them verify that. All right, John, sorry.
So with that knowledge, I guess my question actually goes to Joe. Do you want to look at adding some of those things into a different section, or making a part of the use of force continuum in some way? As as Chad was saying, as a consideration within that totality of circumstances, it may already be in there in some way, but.
So don't forget, later in the discussion, we have something around the use of force continuum, which I assume this would fall under.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, I'll hold off till then, but I think this may be covered under 300.3.2 on the factors. But yeah, I'll hold off till we get to that portion.
Okay, so I think we're good then with that one. Next up is the discussion around the requirement for officers to stop or attempt to stop another officer when force is being inappropriately applied or is no longer required. And that, let me see if I can dig up where that is. Well, I think there's some of it in section 300.5 in the use of force, which is under the reporting of use of force.
302, I think.
It's 300.2.1.
There we go.
2.1. Yeah. Here, let me see if I can just share this so that everyone doesn't have to try to dig for their screens. Oh, it's coming. I think it's trying to load. Oh, that's weird. Well, let's look at it this way until the big screen loads. So This 300.2.1 duty to intercede and report.
Yes, that's it.
A quick question for Chad, if I could. Does that verbiage align with SB 217?
I'd have to look at SB 217 to see if it exactly aligns, but that's also in CRS. As far as intervention and reporting, that's a Colorado revised statute.
I was looking at it with State Patrol, and the verbiage changed just a little bit. I can't think of it offhand, and I should have looked at it before the meeting, but that would just be one recommendation, that we make sure that it aligns with SB 217.
Yeah, I agree with Paul, and it if nothing else, it greatly parallels SB 217. There might be a couple different words or some tweaks that we need to make, but it shouldn't be anything major.
I agree, it's close, but just to make sure.
All right, thank you. We'll get that. Cynthia.
Just a quick question about whether or not, and maybe it's someplace else, is it implied about consequences for failure to do so? Because this strikes me as something that the public might pick apart if they were to be aware of what the policy was. So throughout the use of force, is there something that says, well, if you don't intercede, that there's a consequence to that officer? And if not, should there be?
Not to my knowledge. I don't believe there's anything in there that talks about consequences if you don't intercede during a excessive use of force.
It seems like it's just a very timely issue, and it might be worth considering whether or not there's a recommendation that the police department does want to take a stance on something like that.
And SB 217 has specific language on that, so that may be an area where either referral to that directly or actually making it manifest in the policy may be the way to go.
Yeah, I thought the CRS actually makes it a crime not to. And that's what I think an officer would have knowledge about and would face that penalty.
Hey, could I ask Alex Dortic to weigh in on this, because we may not be able to do anything with this if it's in SB 217. This will be a state issue. And it would be governed by SB 217. Are you in the meeting now?
I am.
Okay.
I'm moonlighting as Chad Reed apparently, but yeah, what Joe just alluded to is absolutely correct. Senate Bill 217, which is now Colorado law, covers many of these areas. So for instance, what we're talking about with the duty to intervene, I think it was Paul who noted this. This is already covered by Senate Bill 217. And so there's specific penalties both under Colorado statute for failing to follow the rules of Senate Bill 217. In addition, all of the police policy and procedure carry with them specific penalties for not following, suspensions, terminations. But far beyond that, Senate Bill 217 requires officers to intervene when there's inappropriate force used by a fellow officer, and duty to report it, and consequences involving both civil, potentially criminal, and post-certification consequences. So there's a lot of protection already there in that specific area. And because of the way Senate Bill 217 is written, if we wanted to do anything outside of that, we're actually precluded from doing that. Now, it certainly doesn't sound like anyone wants to, but to give, and I don't want to talk too long, but to give just a general sense of how this works, if Colorado decides to act as a state and say, we're covering this area, we as a city can't then go outside that. In the strict legal sense, we can't do anything in the area at all, but there's never a case or a fight if we have the exact same language in our code as Colorado statute, but really we're totally constrained by it.
It sounds like we're covered. Thank you.
Thank you. Amy.
Two questions. I think one of the recommendation is to make sure this is reflective of the most recent language, right? So my question is, if it's not, because under this, it's objectively reasonable under the circumstances should report, right? So should is not must and it's not required. So I don't know if that is under the most current law. So should is you should, but it's not right. So it's a very different than required. I'm not sure if that's reflective of the current one, of the current policy of must reporting or legally obliged to.
Does anyone with SB 217 knowledge know if that's a must?
It is a must, and I think Amy has a good point.
All right, thank you. So we'll make sure that this, it seems like this whole section is going to have to refer back to SB 217 largely. John.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up. Sorry, is my bad. Follow-up question. I think there's two parts to look at. One is like statewide, what we're trying to currently do, but I also want to ask specifically for our city, is there disclosure, kind of what Cynthia said about transparency with regards to how many of these happen in our city in terms of when officers do report these? Is there conversation around that?
I can tell you that in my time in Englewood, we've never had an instance where this has occurred.
Or so that could be two things, right? Great that it doesn't, or it's underreporting, right? So I don't know which it is. So that's interesting that in your time, how hear that has not happened, right? What do you, I wanted to ask the police officers here, like, what do you guys think of that? Like the reasons behind that there is zero reporting of this.
This is Letitia. I think the commander said what he did is because we haven't had a reason to report it. Does that make any sense? I just lost my train of thought. We haven't had an incident where a police officer was in a position where he or she, you know, had the duty to report. We have not had that specific incident, which means we haven't reported it because there's nothing to report. Does that make any sense? Help me out, somebody. Commander.
No, it makes perfect sense. I think there's a misconception that this is happening all the time, and that simply is not the case.
Right.
I've taught use of force in this agency for the better part of 13 years, and we give our officers and provide them with tools and techniques and skills and abilities to protect themselves, to protect citizens, to protect each other. Excessive force is simply not it's not something that's taking place in our organization. I will tell you this though, and I'm not trying to get off on a tangent, but if we ever have a use of force complaint, those automatically go to an internal affairs investigation for a full-blown start to finish investigation, no matter what.
I'll chime in on that for Amy a little bit more, is that in some cases you'll have a complainant who decides he doesn't want to follow through with the rest of the investigation or write a statement. But use of force complaints have always been high on our list, at least mine. And if that person bows out of the investigation, we'll follow through with that to the end, because just because they bow out doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so we try to make sure that we investigate it as thoroughly as we can.
It's investigated as thoroughly, no matter how do I say this, how the person's perception of the use of force, you know, being shoved by a police officer as opposed to getting hit in the face or kicked or what have you. They're all investigated. No matter what the perception is of that person that's filing this complaint. I mean, they're taken very, very seriously because, I mean, in our eyes as police officers, you know, if we had to shove somebody, if you will, for whatever reason, you know, we may not perceive that as excessive use of force, but the important thing is that that person that on the other end, on the receiving end, if you will, that's their perception, and it's investigated.
So Amy, before we jump to John, I want to make sure that we're giving you the answers that you're seeking here, because it sounds like yours is more of a reporting question.
Right. It's hard to, so if the data is saying that there's 0 people reporting use of force of their colleagues, right, in the situation, that's what we're saying, not community members, but of another officer, right? And I think the officers are saying that it just does not happen to the extent that an officer would need to report, right? And so, I mean, 2 parts. I don't know how to answer this. One part is, if that really is the case, and if that's the situation, I think that's part of our communication with our community members about that. Like, you know what, like, this is what's happening in Inglewood. This is what our use of force looks like in our policy, and we don't have it because of X, Y, and Z. And that's part of the conversation, right? And then allows the community members to then speak into that, because for me, 0, it's an outlier, right? That there's 0 in my mind. But that's just looking at numbers. And so if Inglewood really is doing that well with that and not using excessive use of force, that's also something to promote. But at the same time, I have nothing more to add to that.
I think I know what Amy's getting at. And just to give you maybe a better example, we had an officer chase a handcuffed individual. He had just tried to sexually exploit a juvenile. And in the process of that foot chase, he shoved him in the back to try to get him to stop running. Well, as that took place, the individual fell down and wound up with a brain bleed, if you will. And consequently, that person passed away several days later. And so my first call was to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, because that's a concern about excessive force or improper use of force. And so we had an outside agency come in along with the district attorney, and they found that the officer's actions were valid. And but you know, it's not like we don't look at those very seriously. That I'm giving you one example of one that really got our attention, but that's how we look at each and every one of them. And I am not afraid to call in the DA or another agency to investigate us, because I think that's the best way to do it, to show that it's unbiased.
All right, I got a bunch of hands here, and I want to kind of keep this going. If we got some solid recommendations, otherwise we could probably talk about this for quite a while. John, Joe, and Paul.
So going along with Amy's train of thought about reporting is what our response is when we do get a use of force complaint, both if it were to come from a fellow officer for a use of force complaint, and if it comes from a citizen, as far as what our response is around the officer in question. And then I think part of it, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. Sorry, I had a really long work day. Are we cultivating a culture? And I believe that the answer is probably yes, but I also believe that just about everybody can always do a little bit better. But are we cultivating a culture in which it would be a kind of a natural response for one of our officers to intercede if there was excessive force being applied, and to report it if there was excessive force being applied? And I have a feeling that the answer is probably yes, but I'd like to hear a little bit about it, maybe, if that makes sense.
Well, I hope that's the culture I've created over the last 11 years. I can tell you probably in the past that I could think of a few cases where one officer was fired, and this is well before the law was put into place. But you know, there are certain things we don't tolerate here, and certainly that's one of them. And so I would hope that the answer to your question is yes.
And I guess maybe like Amy was talking about like promoting this kind of aspect of Inglewood PD, and it might be part of some of the other stuff that we've talked about in community engagement. You know, that community engagement where we're going into the neighborhoods and you know, doing events to have people come to the PD while the PD is in the neighborhood and talking to them, giving them information and updates and stuff like that. Just making that something that's sort of a focal point of that communication with the community. Yeah, that's, I feel like I'm not explaining myself well, so I'm just gonna shut up. I'm sorry.
All right, John, and if you come back with a recommendation or something, just let us know or drop it to us in a note. Joe?
My question is for Chief Collins. Under what circumstances do you refer a use of force or excessive force complaint to the DA? You're on mute.
One of my opinion or staff's opinion is that they did, or if there's even a question about it. And, you know, what we do here is kind of a sit down and a total analysis of each and every case, and we render our decisions. If for some reason, I ultimately have the final decision, but I am not one to just callously say, no, it's not excessive force. If I need another opinion, having worked for the DA's office in the past, I'm not afraid to go to them for advice or to take a look at a particular case. This way I've done my due diligence. And so we've referred a few cases, not necessarily use of force, but other cases out to the DA's office simply for their review to make sure that we've done everything right. And each time they've come back in a positive way. So Joe, that's the cross that I have to bear, if you will, that if I have a doubt about my decision, it goes to the DA's office.
So if there's anything unclear about the case and you think that it's possible that you can't tell, you want to refer that to, you want the decision to be made by an outside agency, and the DA, I think that, I mean, it just makes a lot of sense. The more of these you refer to, you know, where there's any question at all, refer them to the DA. They don't have a, you know, they don't have skin in the game in the same way I think as an internal investigation does. And so I think maybe they're in a better position to look at it neutrally. So I appreciate that you're doing that. I don't know if there's a recommendation around that, but I do think that that's a good practice.
It's probably a practice that some agencies should probably take more advantage of. They're there to help you and to answer your questions. You know, anytime a department investigates themselves, it lends itself to criticism because of the outcome that they reach, which is why now I have Alex from the city attorney's office and human resources director on my review committee for excessive force to get that outside opinion. And thus far, it's been really successful. So.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's it.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
This might surprise you, John, but I'll go ahead and let you keep going. I don't have a policy recommendation. I was just going to speak to Amy's question.
Okay. All right. Mike.
Yeah, my question, I think it's actually a question for probably Paul. Just to follow up on Chief Collins, your comments around how the decisions are made of how to handle any excessive force complaints, and I have full trust in you that you take those complaints very seriously. I'm curious, just what are the models across the nation around how those complaints are handled? Is it typical for those complaints to go to the chief, really just the office of the chief, and for that the office of the chief to be the decision maker around whether they go to continue in an investigation or whether they don't merit that? Are there other models out there? Is that the best practice? Or I'd be curious if yeah.
I think it's the best practice for us. And what I would say is that, and thank goodness I don't work for a very large organization, because I'm going to guess that the chief never hears about a lot of the discipline or non-discipline that is divvied out or not divvied out. And because they're so large, for a chief to review every disciplinary action in a 1,300 member department, it's probably not going to happen. So he has to, put trust in his staff. But, we have a policy where it goes through an internal investigation. It goes through my command staff. They render their decisions, but I won't look at those decisions. And that's the way I do it. And I render a decision to myself, and then I look at their suggestions. And more often than not, we're on the same side of the decision-making process, but sometimes we disagree, and it's not, it could be about rudeness or something. But if I have any concern whatsoever that this may be a criminal act, it's incumbent upon me, and I think legally, to do something about it. And I think that comes, probably malfeasance or something like that. But if you overlook it and you don't do anything about it, you get yourself in big trouble, which is why I am never afraid to look for help with the DA's office, having worked there. So.
Thank you. And so just to clarify, I may have missed this, and if I did, I apologize. But so is that every single complaint of excessive force would make it to your desk, or would some of them kind of get put aside? Every single complaint would make
every one of them. Every complaint about rudeness, everything I get to see.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Chief, if I can just touch on that real quick regarding Mike's question. A lot of times people will call in to make a complaint, whether it's a rudeness complaint or a procedural complaint or a potential policy violation complaint, and they get resolved before they go to an internal affairs investigation. Well, we will have people call in and say, I want to make a use of force complaint against this officer or these officers. And many times, like Chief said earlier, they will back out of that complaint, but we will still move that complaint forward as if they were still initiating that complaint, so we can make sure our officers took the appropriate action.
All right. Sorry, John, you've got one.
Yeah. So I guess my question is, what is that policy in writing and in place somewhere? And can we be sure that it will continue to be the policy after Chief Collins retires, hopefully no time soon? And after the current command staff is gone, because I know, I think that this is a really great practice, but I want to make sure that it's a practice that continues, for years to come.
I would say no. It's the one that I've created a protocol more so than a policy. And, and I would suspect that if some new chief came in, they may have a different way of doing it. And so you're right. I think that's for a conversation for me to have with the city manager and city council as to the process. And then that's the process that we follow. Not everything has to be policy. A protocol is just a process that you follow. And I'm very comfortable with that. And so if a new chief were to come in and change it, then I would think the city manager and council should be aware of it.
Thank you.
Would that happen if a new chief came in and changed that protocol? Would there be an accountability structure? Would they have to get that change in protocol approved based on the current regulations? I just don't know.
If I were to leave tomorrow, I bet you Mr. Stone would make sure that it would be in there. It really
I only got
is,
a 4-year term, though.
it is incumbent on the city manager. And that's why it's important for me to have a great working relationship with the city manager. So where he's aware of changing policies, and including council. This way we're all on the same page. So when something does happen, you're not taken aback by it. But if a city manager is suddenly surprised by a policy that he was unaware of, then that would be my fault or our fault for not communicating that with each other. And so I think it's important that all three parties, the city manager, council, and I, are on the same page.
So I'm hearing a lot of discussion on this, but is there a desire to make a recommendation or to codify what Chief is doing currently?
I think I would recommend, I hear your point, Chief, on, not everything needs to be a full policy. But this practice or the protocol that you have in place of every complaint of use of force lands on the chief's desk, that seems like a really good practice to me, especially given kind of the current climate. It makes the Inglewood Police look really good to be able to say that. And if for no other reason than just to cement the legacy that you're leaving, I think it would be great to codify that practice.
I think it's a good idea too.
Any other thoughts?
Pete isn't going anywhere though, right? We're talking as if he's leaving.
You're right. Yeah.
Better not be anytime
20
soon.
20 years from now when
Easy. Okay.
All right. I think we're good there. Did someone else have a hand up though? Did I miss anybody? Nope. Joe.
I just wanted to clarify, we mean to take that practice of reviewing every single use of force complaint and put it into the policy manual and the procedure, the police, to officially put that down as a policy within the department. Is that what's being recommended? Okay, yeah, I think that's a good recommendation.
Yeah, I think so. Especially from what I'm hearing, that seems like it's reasonable to do given the size of the organization of Inglewood PD.
Well, that's good public relations. If that's out there, if that's known and out there, that's just good information that the public knows that if they make a complaint, it's going to be investigated. So yeah. I like that.
All right, Paul and then Amy.
What's the learning cycle for that? So when you have a bad outcome or you have a complaint that comes through, how does that translate back to your training department and improve performance going forward? It's important that it lands on the chief's desk, and I think making those decisions about discipline and things like that is important. But how does that inform practice going forward? And is there a feedback loop for that?
I can speak to that. Once these complaints or use of force reviews go through the incident review committee, if we have training relative to use of force, arrest control, defensive tactics, taser, you name it, they get put to the in-house subject matter expert to get with the officer for remedial training, and then that's documented in their journal.
And so for that individual officer, but we know, I mean, I'm a social scientist, right? So people in similar situations with similar training and experience tend to respond in similar ways. And so we get repeated outcomes across time and people. So how does that get out to the rest of the department, either from a training perspective to improve?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Paul. So what we would do is we would implement that into our in-service training. And I can give you a really, really quick example. A lot of times we see people that are passive resistive. They're laying on their stomach. They've got their hands under their chest, and they won't give their hands to the officer after repeated verbal commands. We found that Krav Maga was using a specific technique that our officers were not implementing, and it came out of a review of a use of force, and we started implementing that into our annual in-service training. So it doesn't just get back to a single officer, it gets out department-wide.
Thank you so much, Commander Reed.
I was going to ask the same thing, like, what do we do with that data? So thank you.
All right, great. Okay, I think we're we're moving on. So the next one up is moving vehicles, and I'll try to share my screen and can show you. There's a couple paragraphs in the use of force document on that. Right, so section, if you're following along, 300.4.1. And so here, I guess we do have this feasible language has already been inserted. And so I guess I'm wondering if there's any questions or thoughts about this particular item.
Yeah, I'll chime in. It just in reading these couple paragraphs, this might be a semantic thing, but the first sentence, the introduction to the section, mentions two different scenarios. So number one being shots fired at a moving vehicle and shots fired from a moving vehicle. And then the rest of the section really only addresses shots being fired at a moving vehicle. And so I'd love to hear a little bit of discussion on what the policies are, whether Inglewood PD would ever fire from a moving vehicle, or just hear from the group whether we think that scenario that's introduced in that first sentence should be addressed in the rest of this section. And maybe
Well, John, I think John, you're the only one that's got something. So go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like, I'm sorry, what were you about to say, Mike?
Oh, I was going to say maybe the first question. I'm curious to hear what you would say, but maybe the first question would be to the officers on the call. Like, would a shot ever be fired from a moving vehicle?
I'd like to hear the answer to that question too, because it feels like it's unlikely.
Well, it is unlikely, but again, we're going back to semantics of could it ever happen? And the answer is, given the correct set of circumstances, the totality of the circumstances, yes, it could happen. It's unlikely though. Regarding shooting at a moving vehicle, we had an officer involved shooting a year and a half ago, where we had officers shoot at a moving vehicle simply because they could not get out of the path of the moving vehicle. So even though it's in policy that it's rarely effective, these officers had no choice.
Mhm.
So I know that I'm going from one end of the spectrum to the other, but I would speculate that it is more likely for them to shoot at a vehicle coming at them than from a moving vehicle. But again, never say never.
Yeah. So what I hear in that is it would be distinct from something like a warning shot, because previously what we heard was there would be no circumstance in which a warning shot would ever be fired. What I'm hearing here is this is similar to like a shot at a moving vehicle that we don't want to say never, because there may be a circumstance that requires it. But I think maybe my recommendation would be that we just add language that delineates some of those even just some language that addresses the situation of shots being fired from a moving vehicle.
Paul, I saw that your hand was up. Is that on this one or something separate?
It is, and just the direction is I think the right direction in the conversation. New York State banned shooting at moving vehicles, and then almost instantly, within a year, they had a circumstance where someone was using a vehicle as an instrument of terrorism to run people over, and officers, ended up having to, against policy, shoot into a vehicle to stop that terrorist attack, and so the state had to reverse those policies, right? So I think understanding that there are circumstances that we can't take into account necessarily when we're kind of imagining work, that it's reasonable not to make an absolute here.
Yeah, that's helpful, and I'm comfortable with the policies around shooting at a moving vehicle. I think that point is well taken. That makes sense. Again, I'm trying to spark some discussion about shots fired from a moving vehicle. Like, I assume that, given if it's feasible to exit the vehicle before taking a shot, that would be the appropriate action. But I just don't see any really guidance like that reflected in this section.
Perhaps the one from shooting from a moving vehicle would include the language of it's how would I put it? It's really not a good idea, but if you're doing it to save your life or the life of another person, I think that would be the kind of verbiage that you would put in there.
Yeah.
And so,
Sorry. Yeah, there are two cases, one of them out of Connecticut, where an officer started taking rounds as they were pulling up. The officer couldn't put the car in park, was shooting as they were getting out of the car. And that would be a circumstance where the vehicle was certainly still moving. The officer actually fell over as they were getting out and turning fire in that circumstance. So again, these things, they happen. They're dynamic events. And unfortunately, it's hard to take into account when we're writing policy. And I hate to see an officer get hung up in hindsight because we've put a policy in a place that is absolute. I think discouraging shooting from moving vehicles when possible certainly is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I wouldn't advocate for any type of absolutes because I hear your point, and I mainly what I'm advocating for is just addressing that scenario in this section, and I trust the policy writers to come up with the best language and the best practice around that. I just frankly kind of think it's odd that it's introduced and then not addressed.
Yeah, you're right. What I would tell the group is that anytime an officer fires his weapon at like a situation here or at somebody, as a practice, once again, we call out the 18th Judicial Critical Incident Team, a shoot team, if you will, and they will investigate the entire matter and then bring it to the district attorney to review for if there was any criminality on the part of the officer's actions. And so there is a follow-up to all this, and we're not the sole determination of what happens if somebody does violate this.
All right, John, and then Joe,
Yeah.
real quick if we can. Thank you.
I'm wondering if we just replicate the language around shooting at a moving vehicle and change what's necessary to make it shooting from a moving vehicle, so that it would essentially say, when feasible, officers should take reasonable steps to stop, or, I don't even know if that's necessary, but an officer should only discharge a firearm from a moving vehicle when the officer reasonably believes there are no other reasonable means available to avert the imminent threat of, another vehicle, of, whatever it needs to be, but kind of reversing the language so that it's the officer in the vehicle versus shooting at a moving vehicle. Does that kind of get to what you were at, Mike?
Yeah, I would be comfortable with that.
All right, Joe.
I was just gonna say along those lines, if there's any way to just make it really, really simple. Shots fired at or from a moving vehicle involve additional considerations and risks and are rarely effective and should be avoided when feasible. Just as a general, I think that's what the policy's getting at. It's just clear, explicitly stated. But if there's a better way to do that, we can send it over to the city attorney's office, but wouldn't want to totally, prevent that and put that consideration on officers. But if it's feasible, they shouldn't do it. And so if it's feasible to avoid it, then they shouldn't do it. So I think it makes sense to put it in there.
Yeah, and so I think that is the request that we have logged here, right? Which is just to add into this section, right? This discussion and language around shots fired from a moving vehicle, based on what we've all said here. All right, anything else on this one? All right, I think next up, let me make sure, is the use of force continuum. And I'll be honest with you, I really struggled to find much in this current use of force doc, and I think there's some stuff also in the 21st century reporting. But I guess maybe it might help if Chief, if you or someone else can point us to or discuss a little bit about what the use of force continuum is in practice for Inglewood Police Department.
Bad. I think this is right up Chad's alley.
Yeah, the use of force, the verbiage use of force continuum is truly a dated term. When I started 20 years ago, that was how officers were able to use force against force being used on them. And it went up and down a continuum ladder, if you will, and force is not perceived that way now. Force is based on reasonableness, given facts and circumstances perceived by an officer at the time of the event. So the continuum is somewhat outdated. You'll still see a lot of information on that online, but we don't address it in our use of force policy. We address our use of force relative to what is reasonable, and that goes back to Graham versus Connor.
Great, thank you for that. I'm sorry, Cheryl, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I should have raised my hand. Thank you, John. So, Chad, do you feel we should, so it should remain, but I mean, in terms of the recommendations, should it be deleted then, given Englewood's response to this topic area?
Cheryl, I don't think it's even in there anymore. I know we used to have a very small portion, just one paragraph in there about use of force continuum, but we have not trained on a continuum in years. You know, everything that we train on is based on the perspective of another reasonable officer given the same set of circumstances. So it doesn't limit our officers as to what tools and techniques they can use. It's all based truly on reasonableness. So to answer your question, I think the language should remain the way it is.
And it doesn't appear as though there's any discussion of continuum in the current use of force policy. So the request from City Council, or it may be a legacy request that we just don't need to worry about based on what we've heard here today.
Well, I'd be curious to hear what Paul has to say about my belief on continuum, use of force continuum, and it being such an outdated system or belief system.
Yeah, I think it's problematic for a couple of reasons. A, it's not how people make decisions in the moment. So it's a model that doesn't reflect decision making from the officer's perspective. It sets up an unrealistic expectation from the public, and it can be problematic if an officer is making decisions based on the 1+ standard, and we're not necessarily at that place. We want creative problem solving, working toward the least amount of force possible, right, or reasonably possible to resolve the situation. And the continuum gets kind of misconstrued and misused in civil suits, and it's certainly not an effective decision tool as like it was designed. So I don't think, if it's not there, we shouldn't add it. That would be my recommendation.
I agree with Paul.
All right, good deal. That's one less thing to worry about tonight. And then let me scroll back. So the last one then for today for discussion is fleeing felon. So let me see if I can. So don't think, oh no, it's in here. I don't think that there's anything specifically right in the use of force document around fleeing felons. And so Chief or Chad, is there another place where there's language or discussion around use of force with fleeing felons?
I'm not seeing it in the use of force policy, but for some reason, I think there is language in Letsipol relative to fleeing felon. It should be in use of force, but I'm not sure why it's not. I might have to research this a little bit.
That goes back to the same issue with SB 217, and also you know, the Graham standard. I think all of those things articulate that. So you would want to be careful about adding something outside of that language.
Do you know what the language around fleeing felons specifically is, Paul? Like maybe not the exact verbiage, but do you know kind of what the gist of it is?
Not in SB 217. I know it addresses it, and I'm not sure exactly the language that's used, but essentially officers can't use force against a non-violent felon, and
Okay.
in using force, it has to be with the understanding that that person is either imminently, there's an imminent threat of them using force against somebody else, right? Or gaining a position of advantage against that police officer in order to use force against them. So there has to be an imminent and ongoing threat if a fleeing felon is shot. And Chief and Chad, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I understand it the exact same way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I just did a quick web search, and it seems like it is in there. So maybe it's best we roll this one into our earlier recommendation to mirror the SB 217 language.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, officers are trained to, a fleeing felon has to be a totality of the circumstances. We train relative to, Tennessee versus Garner on the fleeing felon rule. But there's so many variables that are taken into account when you're using deadly force on a fleeing felon.
So I guess my question is there felony status something that permits the use of deadly force in situations where it otherwise would not have been?
Do you mean relative to Senate Bill 217 or just in general?
I mean, if we know what Senate Bill 217 says, that would be great. I don't think any of us do. I was trying to read it, and it's just so thick at this point that it's a waste of time for me to try to read it. But
a fleeing felon must pose an immediate risk to other officers or the public for us to use deadly force. And there's a lot of variables, access to a weapon, whether or not they just caused serious bodily injury or death and now they're fleeing. And there's so many different variables that you can put into play on a fleeing felon. And again, I would encourage the group to read Tennessee versus Garner, because that's what we train on, similar to Graham versus Connor relative to our use of force. So it just has to be, if a felon is fleeing police and they don't pose an immediate risk to other officers or the public, we cannot use deadly force.
Yeah,
that's for everybody else too, though, right? Like if there was somebody who was not a felon, who had just committed a crime and was a deadly threat and was fleeing, while shooting through a neighborhood or something like that, like that's a deadly force situation anyway.
That's a deadly force situation, yes.
And John, it's not their felony status through the criminal justice system. It's did they commit a felony?
Gotcha. Okay.
A violent felony. There are statutes that talk about escapees, for instance, and there's levels of force that can be used against escapees who are continuing to try to escape. But that's different. What we're talking about here is somebody who's in the process or will continue to commit violent felonies against people if they escape or get away.
Gotcha. So
right.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. I guess I don't know if it's something that we need to address. My concern that I have in my head, I don't think is necessarily something for us here, but that really helps out that it's somebody who has committed, has been observed committing a felony now. This is how they're to be dealt with under these various types of circumstances. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Amy, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. So on the policies, it's fleeing subject. So that's to be clear. I know national policy, all these things, right? So but my concern here today is Inglewood, right? So how do we have information in terms of, I mainly ask this as a citizen, right? And we see so much conversations about people fleeing and officers shooting. There's a lot of understanding or misunderstanding about those situations. So I think these conversations today help me understand some of these things, right? But every day when folks are seeing in the news, this is what I think everyday folks think about. But in our own city, do we have conversations or transparency in terms of how many situations happen like annually about fleeing subjects and officers needing to shoot because of those?
Well, I think I know, I haven't answered a part of your question. We get in foot pursuits quite often. And at the end of those pursuits, if we're able to catch that person, they're taken into custody probably at gunpoint because the officer has no idea how they're, what they're running from. But the simple fact that a person runs does not give the officer the authority to shoot them. And so, in fact, we haven't shot anybody that's run in quite some time that I can even remember. And so, once again, you know, Chad will tell you that it's within our training. If you don't know why they're running, that's one thing, but you certainly can't shoot them because knowledge after the fact does not give you then your reason. It's the information that you have on hand. And so, again, foot pursuits are quite common. And the outcomes are generally that way. They either get away or taken into custody without the need to shoot somebody because we don't have that reason to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. But my question still is, do we have information in terms of how many times that happens in our city? Or just transparency, like where a citizen can go and find out how many of these incidents happen in our city, regardless of reason?
We don't have a database that, I mean, I guess we could create one that illustrates the number of foot pursuits or vehicle pursuits, if there need be. I mean, that question's never come up. So, but it has now.
Yeah, because I know in our city, just from the town hall and different things, the highest concern of crime is really about burglary, right, in our city. If that's most common. And so, so I would imagine it would be pretty low in our city. That's all I'm imagining as a matter of communication about this.
Amy, is your request for like on the reporting end of this data, like to start tracking this data or making it publicly available in some way?
Yes, right. And this is, you know, me as a social worker and social scientist also as well. I think bias, prejudice, all these things could play into these kind of decisions, right, in terms of fleeing felons or fleeing subjects. And so I think having transparency will help, you know, us communicate what Inglewood Police is doing. And, you know, if it's really reasonable, then I think it should be promoted as well, that this is a positive in terms of how little that happens and proportionalities of that.
I'm sorry, Mike, and then John.
Yeah, I would say in terms of the fleeing felon, I think I heard Chad kind of suggest that a section could be added to the use of force policy to even mirror some of the language in some of the other maybe statewide or nationwide policies. But I would feel comfortable recommending that a section be added and then allowing council will be able to review it based on our other recommendations. So I think we could recommend a section be added on guidance around fleeing felons and then trust council to review it when the time comes. I know that doesn't speak to Amy's concerns, but
well, maybe we have two separate concerns here, right? So Amy's got one that's on the reporting side of it, right, in the data, and then yours is more on the language and the insertion of fleeing felons language into the Inglewood use of force policy.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I will say, let me make sure before we kind of go too deep in this, is that my understanding is that even if it goes into the Inglewood use of force policy, it still is going to have to mirror what SB 217 says. Right. And the only thing that theoretically might happen with the city of Inglewood is that you put something in place that's above and beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah. And am I incorrect in understanding that there's other content in Inglewood's use of force policy that is also mirrored in other policies. Is that correct? Or is the use of force policy only above and beyond other existing policies? And I guess my reasoning behind asking that is if it's true that there is other content that is simply mirrored, that's reinforcing this is Inglewood's policies, then the precedent is there to add a section on fleeing felon. And if it's true, if it's true that Inglewood's use of force policy is only above and beyond, then yeah, the precedent would probably not be there for my recommendation.
Mike, I'm trying to pull up our entire policy right now because I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure we have a fleeing felon section in there, and I'm just trying to locate it.
Okay.
And if I could just mention, ever since I have SB 217 up, and fleeing felon is not referenced in there. And so I think, Mike, to your question, there are things that absolutely mirror what's exactly written. There are even words, shall, may, you know, things like that. They're pulled straight from the statute. And then there's other things that are not here. So, and fleeing felon is not one of the ones that comes from the state statute.
All right, John and then Joe.
So I wanted to follow up on Amy's recommendation for data around pursuits and things of that nature. I personally would like to see us collate all possible data, basically. I think that if officers are engaged in some kind of activity, they report on it, right? They're required to report on literally everything that they do, every contact that they have with subjects in the course of their duties for the day. And that's all data as far as I'm concerned. And if they're recording it anyways, then it should be collated in a way that's accessible, and that information should be shared with the public. And we've talked about creating like a page on the city website or something like that where we could share this data, and just maintaining that and having it available on a regularly upkept kind of basis, I think would be a really good thing for us to do. And then presenting that data, like we said, quarterly to council, regularly in neighborhoods to do direct community engagement. But I think Amy's totally right that we should be able to access that information, and it should be presented in a way that's consumable.
Yeah, I was going to jump in. I don't want Amy to think she got forgotten. Quite frankly, I've been running it through my head, and I think Chad will agree. Most of those foot pursuits probably wind up with some level of force that has to be used. Let's say a firearm to compel arrest. Just the pointing of the firearm. And so we document those. So in my mind, I think we could probably capture, like John said, probably if probably all of those, and that would also include vehicular pursuits. And I think if you're going to do one, you should do the other. And with our new RMS system coming up in October, I believe that information probably now, but will be available for public consumption.
All right, thank you for that. Joe.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the questions of the overlap with SB 217. I wasn't clear if that's something where we just mirror the language, or if it's better to leave those things out if it's covered by SB 217. So I just want to see if in the recommendations we run that by our city attorney before we see it, to know what the best approach is to that in terms of the legal aspect of it, whether we legal it. I do think if we go beyond it, make it more restrictive, then we would certainly need to put that in our policy. But it doesn't sound like there's a lot other than maybe the fleeing felon, unless Chad's come across something like that. But that does sound like something that maybe is not in SB 217. I certainly couldn't find it. It sounded like Cynthia couldn't find it. So If that's not in there, I think we should put that in a recommendation, that we put that in our policy somewhere, if it's neither in SB 217 or in our existing policies somewhere.
I personally would be okay with mirroring the language wherever possible too. I don't think that it, if we're simply saying, here's what SB 217 says, and we're matching it in our policy, there's no way in which that's a problem. And I think it shows a dedication on the part of our city and our PD to proactively affirm those things within our own policies and codes.
All right, I
Hey,
see a lot of heads nodding.
John, anyone familiar here with SB 217 and can point out where fleeing felon is? Because I don't see it anywhere either.
No, that's what I was saying. It's not there. It's not in the rule.
Alex?
It is actually there.
There you go.
Yeah, it is actually there. It's not titled fleeing felon, but it's under 181707 section 3, talking about the arrest is for a felony involving use or threat of deadly physical force. So that's, while it's not entitled fleeing felon, that's what's referred to as fleeing felon.
What's the number again? 18.
Oh, geez, sorry. 1707 section 3. And it is exactly as Chad had stated, that it's making using deadly physical force to make an arrest only when all other means of apprehension are unreasonable. The arrest is for a felony, including the use or threatened use of physical force. Suspect poses an immediate threat to the peace officer or another person. The force employed does not create a substantial risk of injury to other persons.
I see it now.
Alex, were you reading that from Senate Bill 217?
Yes.
Okay, I found ours as well within our own policy, our use of force policy. If everybody has that up still, it's 300.4 deadly force applications. John, I don't know if you can share that screen or not.
All right, we're 300.4. Did you say 4?
Yeah, it's called deadly force applications.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so if everyone can look at subsection B, an officer may use deadly force to stop a fleeing subject when this officer has probable cause to believe that that individual has committed, intends to commit a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily injury or death. That would be our fleeing felon policy.
It looks to me like SB 217 might just be a little more specific than that, so we should maybe just update it to align with SB 217.
I agree. It does look a little bit more specific and possibly a little bit more restrictive.
How so, Joe? I don't have SB 217 in front of me.
Well, it's got more words, so it's longer. Let's see, I'll read it. A peace officer is justified in using deadly physical force to make an arrest only when all their means of apprehension are unreasonably given the circumstances, and the arrest is for a felony involving conduct including the use of threatened use of deadly physical force. The suspect poses an immediate threat to the peace officer or another person. The force employed does not create a substantial risk of injury to other persons, and a peace officer shall identify himself or herself as a peace officer and give a clear verbal warning of his or her intent.
I like your policy wording better, but I think you have to go with SB 217 and make sure it's aligned.
All right. Well, it seems as though there's general agreement that we need to align that section 300.4 with SB 217. Any other thoughts on this one? All right. Wow. 10 minutes. I'm going to give you back at least a few of those 10 minutes. Oh, John raised his hand. All right, John.
I'm sorry, real quick.
Just kidding. Just kidding.
I have a work thing next Wednesday. I thought that it was going to be over before this meeting is supposed to happen, and I'm going to beg and plead and offer favors. I'll mow your lawn, trim the hedges, walk your dog. If there's any possible way that we could, all 16 of us, shift to Thursday next week. I apologize for not bringing this to everybody weeks ago. If it's not possible, I understand, and I'll do what I can to get here. But I thought the work thing was supposed to be done at 6, and it's supposed to be done at 9. So.
Well, I can be a slight bearer of some bad news. I have a block on next Thursday, so I couldn't facilitate. I guess if
Then
the
it
group
sounds like
wanted
the
to,
answer is no.
could figure something out.
Makes it easy.
Sorry.
I'll see if I can cut away from the thing, at least for a little bit of it. So.
Okay, and we'll have the notes, and we can kind of do that catch up with you. And I think too, the other thing I would suggest is if you get the pre-read and you do that and realize there's some recommendations you have, if you could send those to us in advance, then we can make sure we address them. And then hopefully the notes will have everything that you need in there, and we can come back to it the following week, because it's just a continuation of the alternate policing discussion.
Cool. Awesome. I appreciate it.
That's a bummer, John. I was definitely going to take you up on that dog walking offer.
Hey, it's still on the table if you can talk John into shifting his Thursday around.
Must be a good dog. So I think just to preview next week, it's alternate policing, and we've got it broken into a couple sections. But I guess here's a question that I have for the group. I think we probably have Cynthia and I believe Brittany, right, Chief? You gave me Brittany and maybe Sam's name as folks that might come in and be able to talk a little bit about some of the programs. And my question is one, for this group, how much background do you feel you need on the program, STAR, Cahoots, the co-responder program, just to kind of get a level set, so that then we can get into talking about recommendations or any ideas or things that folks might want to consider changing? But I want to get an understanding of how much background we need, because we could probably spend 2 hours just doing background. Paul.
During the city council meeting, I think it was a member of Cahoots talked about how in Oregon, and I can't remember which city specifically, but that they had taken over a certain number of calls for the police department. The data point that I was missing on that was, what did the actual police department call volume look like? So was there actually a change in that call volume? So I realized they started picking up calls, but I'm just wondering what the police department call volume looked like after they started picking up calls. Was there a change in actual police work?
So I can tell you that data is definitely available, and I can get that information from them and forward it on to everybody. I'll forward it on to John, and he can put it in the files and whatnot. My understanding is that there was no notable change in overall call volume. There was just a change in what law enforcement had to directly intervene or respond to, because the Cahoots program was responding to a significant portion of those calls instead of the police department responding to those calls. So there was no notable change in the number of 911 calls being made. There was a notable change in the number of calls that the police department responded to.
Yeah, so I'd be interested in what police hours look like. So what
Yeah,
what
gotcha.
what were police doing with that extra time
Sure.
when Cahoots filled that gap?
I'm pretty sure that
Was
I
there-
can get that information.
Was there a change in arrest rates? Was there a change in contacts? Like what? How did that change on that side? In the 911 calls, that's great, and they're handling that, and that's good. That was good info. But as I was thinking about it, and I've seen some other studies where that space is filled with other things. And I'm just wondering what fills that space.
Well, I know our department sent me some kind of top line information, sort of 10,000 foot view, if you will, that showed that approximately 40% of our officers' time is currently spent responding to like wellness checks and blanking on the other terms that were put in there, but essentially non-criminal activity. And it largely centered around medical and mental health issues. And that's part of the reason that I'm so interested in expanding the co-responders program to bring more co-responders in, is to see if we can, at the very least, have more co-responders available as a resource to the officers. Because I think that that's a great program. I think that it's been proven to be very effective. And so if we can expand that, I think it would be beneficial to our officers and to our community.
All right, thanks.
Sorry, I kind of started next week, didn't I? I apologize.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that the other folks have some time so that if there is some prep work or something we need to pull together, that we can have that discussion. So I'm going to mess up the order, but Amy, and then I think Joe, Cynthia, Reed. And that's probably the wrong order.
I think it would, if possible, any readings of efficacy of either of the programs that we want to adopt, any reports, research articles, anything about the program background, the more I can read ahead of time, I think I can be more informed in my questions next week.
And I'll say we have a bunch of them, so I'll send the links out in the next couple of days, but there are a bunch of reports that we already have access to, and I'll send all those links.
I'd like to see I'd like to get just a little history of our current co-responder program, the impact team, and how that's working. And maybe that could just be Reed McGrath could just summarize that at the beginning of the meeting or something like that. That would be great to have just a little presentation from Sergeant McGrath.
Cynthia, I think it was you. I'm not quite sure.
So I am doing a lot of prep work to be able to present all of the things you all are talking about. So Reed is definitely going to talk about our program. Those other folks you mentioned, as far as I know, are not coming. They're all Health Network employees. And so I will be the sole presenter on a lot of that material. I have some material that I sent to John ahead of time that shows data associated with the program, but we're digging in a little deeper to be able to show that to the group. Amy, in reference to some other articles, I had a meeting with the president of CIT International, and she sent me some of the key pieces on that. There's very little efficacy studies that are done on this, just so you know. But I also have a document that I gave to Reed today that has 50 different co-responder alternative models. And so my plan is, I think one of the things that we often think of is that we think of the Cahoots model and then what we currently have. And so I want to be able to talk about some other options other than just those two without overwhelming this group. So John, it would be helpful for me if you gave me a little bit of a time limit. If you said that I could talk for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and I will tailor the information. And then if you all can just be a little patient with me, as far as it might be later that it might be short notice that I'm actually able to get you some of the information to read ahead of time, with the exception of some of the articles and things like that. Does that sound like an okay plan? Okay.
Yeah, and Cynthia, I'll let you know, but it's going to be, I guess I don't really know. My sense is that there's probably a lot of questions, and if you can answer a lot of those questions without us having to do a massive Q&A, that might help us out. So You know, if we think right now, roughly 15-ish, 20 minutes to the initial, but it sounds like maybe you have more data than that.
I have a lot of data, and in particular, what I'm going to show you is what's happening in Englewood. Because I think one of the challenges is that we talk about what's happening someplace else. And so I am going to focus the conversation on what is actually happening in Englewood, because we have great data on what our co-responders have actually been doing, calls for service. And then I also am going to do some comparison of what that looks like with a Cahoots program, and then also some other models. So I will have all of that. I will send it to you, John, ahead of time as much as possible. And then if I can have some time during the meeting to actually present it after Reed gives an overview of the program, I think that that'll really drive a lot of the discussions about the questions that people have.
Okay, great. That's a plan for me.
Okay, great.
Reed.
Cynthia nailed it. We're excited about next week, and we've got some great things to bring forward. So we'll see you then.
All right. And yeah, I want to give you both a heads up, because and I'll have to go back and look at the emails, but early on, someone had asked me to invite Brittany, I believe, specifically to this session. And so I think there is an invite out there to her. And so I'll circle back with you and let you know if it is, and you can figure out whether or not she's needed or not. But someone gave me that name. Sorry.
It's probably me, and I think Cynthia is going to be, she's a subject matter expert, and she will take care of that. If we need to circle around the following week, we'll bring Brittany, and she's kind of the on-the-ground person.
Okay, thank you. All right. I think that's it. Once again, thank you everybody for your time tonight. I think this is good. We'll send out the notes, and then I'll try to send out as much reading material as I can, like by Friday night or something like that, so that you have all weekend to get a chance. And, for John, if you're not here, to get some notes to us as well.
Yeah, and I was going to ask if Cynthia could send me what she's going to be presenting as well, just so that I can review it also, because I am very interested in the other models as well. I'm not married to any particular concept. I'm married to the idea of making things as good as we can. So I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah, if Cynthia sends it to me, I'll send it to everybody.
Perfect.
All right. Well, have a good night, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you next week.
See y'all.
Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Good night.